So thanks for the introduction. I am at the University of Victoria. I just wanted to I took this yesterday. This is for my Be Real, so like the date is on it. Beautiful Victoria. I have a lot of colleagues in Toronto area, and were telling me about the dump that they had of snow last week. So I just had to show my beautiful Victoria picture from yesterday. However, I did spend 15 years before this in Saskatchewan at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. So I am well aware of my current privilege living on the West Coast. All right, and my long-term research objective that I work on here and have been for the last 25 years is to design, develop, and evaluate novel technologies that improve the social, cognitive, and emotional well-being of people. And as suggested by this picture, in the last decade, or actually more like 2 decades now, I have focused the majority of my research on technologies related to gaming and games, asking this big audacious question of how can we harness the motivational pull of games to benefit people. And the fact that this is basically the question that guides most of my research in general. And the fact that I want my work to benefit people rather than harm them just basically means I'm not some sort of like evil Disney villain. So the more interesting part of this question for today, and I think for this audience in particular, is why games? This is normally a point at which I would try to convince my audience that games are a cultural artifact worthy of study, which basically translates into please publish my work, or that the economic opportunities that games offer means that they're worthy of academic innovation, which might translate into please fund my work. But I feel like in this CHI community now, I'm among friends who want to see all this work published and funded. So I'm going to take the next 45 minutes to talk about why games. Why do I study games? What is it about games that's so compelling? And I want to start with what we know about games. And I think based on the introductions I heard, for some of you, what I'm going to show you might be a little, out of your wheelhouse, or maybe even a little scary. So I'm going to start and ease in with some of the good stuff, which is money. And that is that the global games market generated revenues of almost 188 billion this past year from its 3.5 billion players. And consumers are spending more on games than they are on movies and music combined. This is also true. It's true globally, but it's also true in Canada specifically. But games are more than just a fun leisure activity that people are engaging in for entertainment. Many of you may also be familiar with the concept of esports. This is from a StarCraft tournament, I think, from a long time ago. Esports refers to organized and competitive gaming, and 500 million people in the world are fans. Revenues generated from esports were estimated at 25 billion just a couple of years ago, and the largest esports prize pool to date, which was for playing a game with a bunch of your friends, was 34 million US, which is the same as basically Wimbledon. The prize for winning Wimbledon was that year. Which is kind of amazing when you think about it. Like, you can play a video game, and at the very top levels, you can earn as much in a tournament as you would earn for dedicating your life to tennis. Kids can go to college on an esports scholarship. They can make a career out of it. It's been recently part of the Olympics. The IOC has been integrating esports as well into their plans. And I think that maybe many of you still feel comfortable here. We know that entertainment is business. We get that it generates money, that there's fans, but it still does get even scarier. So this is a picture of my kids when I lived in Saskatoon, and they were visiting their cousins in Vancouver a number of years ago. At this point, they'd only met a handful of times, and only for a very short time. So they didn't really know each other very well. But what this shows is somewhat typical, of kids these days. Around like well over 90% of both boys and girls played games. The average young person also racks up about 10,000 hours of gaming by the time they're 21. This is that same magical number of hours that Anders Ericsson's studies show that virtuoso musicians spent practicing, which you may recognize as popularized and maybe oversimplified by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. But this implies, anyways, that the average young person is a bit of a virtuoso in games by the time that they're in college. And I think this is what a lot of people find really scary, right? These kids are the future leaders of our countries. Well, maybe not these kids exactly, like I know them very well, and that's not likely in their future. But kids in general will one day make our laws and invent new planes, and will perform all the hip surgeries that I need when I get even older. And I'm sure that a lot of you here are thinking that these stats are pretty horrifying. What will a future society run by people who grew up playing so many games, who spent so much of their leisure time staring at a screen, even look like? And I think that you're perhaps thinking of a lot of the negative stereotypes of what happens to people who play games, thinking perhaps of someone like Jenkins. So this is the griefer from the Make Love Not Warcraft episode of South Park. His name is Jenkins. He does a really good job of embodying the number of common stereotypes that people have about computer gamers. So as a researcher and as a parent, I had to think, are these stereotypes founded? Does that $188 billion in revenue come at such a great cost to society, to our development as, adolescents and youths? Do I have to worry that this gamer will turn into this gamer? And really, am I being a bit judgy if we just assume that Jaken's life is somehow not fulfilling? He has, maybe it is fulfilling. All of these negative stereotypes might just be stereotypes, right? He looks like maybe he's a bit lazy and messy, perhaps socially inept, or at least socially isolated. He has a mouse and some energy drinks. He doesn't really even need friends. He's perfectly satisfied with his life as it is. Or does he need friends? So, I want to take a second to pause and ask the question, like, what is it that we really need from our social interactions? Was our friends just, or that social network that we need just for our hunter-gatherer ancestors who needed each other to survive the mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and other droughts and other ancient pestilences, or is that something that's really important right now? Like, why do we need these social connections? And you already know this, I'm sure, but research has shown a lot of importance of our social satisfaction as it leads to health outcomes. So our well-being, our health is affected by our social situation. Social connection or a healthy social life can help us become more resilient to depression, anxiety, and addiction. When people feel socially ostracized, when they feel excluded or left out of groups or society, there are lots of measurable and harmful effects on how they interpret the world around them. There's been research that shows that ambiguous information that comes in when a person is feeling socially isolated or ostracized becomes interpreted as hostile. So they quite literally interpret the world around them as a more threatening place, as quite a bit darker and more threatening. And recent studies are showing that those who live alone or feel socially isolated have an increased risk of mortality as well. And although Canada is at the top of the global rankings for economic and social progress indicators, the rates of mental illness in Canada are higher than world averages, actually. And a lot of this has to do with social isolation. You don't have to be able to read this. I understand that it's going to be very small on your screens, and that's fine, because all I wanted to say from this is the OECD Better Life Index. This is Canada. The arrows on the side, the up arrows indicate positive change over the last decade. The flat arrows indicate no change, and the down arrows indicate decline. So although our earnings are up in Canada, a changing labor market does mean less job certainty. But basically in Canada, most things have been going up for a really long time in terms of our life indices, except for social connectedness. Although other, indicators of wellness have risen in Canada over the last decade, this idea of social connectedness, like the number of people that you have that you could count on in case you have some need to rely on someone else, has fallen in the last decade in Canada. And this isn't just true in Canada. The situation is similar in the UK, in other developed countries. The UK installed a minister of loneliness in 2018. The state of New York followed suit. They chose Dr. Ruth Westheimer as their first loneliness ambassador. We hear a lot about the loneliness epidemic, which is among men and women and youths. We have articles about whether or not Gen Z will be able to make friends in the workplace because their lives are so different than the ones the way that we grew up. So what we know is that good social support can help people be more resilient to depression, but loneliness facilitates depression. Basically, isolation and rejection are harmful, and they're harmful because they thwart this fundamental need that we have as humans to belong to something. And so that's what we know about social connection in terms of the context of our social lives in Canada. And in terms of, our feelings of belonging and how we are kind of part of a society, games and play have always been a really important part of this. And so that's kind of where I come in with my research. This picture that I'm showing now is, it's a well-known Renaissance painting called Children's Games by Peter Bruegel. It was finished in 1560 and depicts Flemish children's activities at the time. It shows over 200 children engaging in 91 different playful activities. And because of its thorough depiction, it's often considered to be an illustrated encyclopedia of children's games of that period. At least 36 of the activities that are going on here have been identified as what we can call games, things like touch tag, lawn bowls, and the rest of these games are still played by children today, having been passed down for, almost 500 years. It's astonishing that these games have survived on playgrounds, because it's not like kids teach adults who then record this and then teach the next generation of kids. Like, kids teach each other on the playground, and that's how these games have survived all this time, handed down from generation to generation. But there's something else about these games that stands out, and that is that all of them are multiplayer games. They're games that are played with other people and not just by yourself. So games have long been used to support social interaction. I'm not a historian, I'm not going to even pretend to be, but I do know that board games, dice games, tile games, sports, all these things go way back, and they've been continuing in different formats. Family board game nights, tabletop gaming and board game stores, weekly poker games among friends. These are the kind of a more modern way of playing games with in a social context, and they have helped us satisfy our need for relatedness and created shared experiences that kind of can draw us closer together. So people play on recreational sports teams, which might be about keeping in shape, but they also do pub trivia, they play chess in the park, they play pool in the bar, and these playful social activities are moving into our digital spaces at a really rapid pace. So digital games are increasingly being used by players to help not just maintain relationships, but to also form them, to form new relationships, both in homes and in kind of more public spaces like gaming bars. They have the additional advantage of assisting distributed players who maybe don't live in the same place to maintain their social connections. So siblings who go off to different colleges can play Fortnite together online. Parents can play Words with Friends with their kids when they move out of home. College friends who move to different cities can play, Destiny or Arc Raiders every Sunday together and try and maintain those relationships over a distance. And this is reflected in a lot of data from different organizations. This is from the Entertainment Software Association, and it's from 2022, and it reports that the majority of gamers play with others because they felt like video games help them connect to their friends. So they choose to, 83% of players are playing with others online or in person because it's helping them to connect to other people. Okay, so I'll pause for a second in terms of what we know so far. People are playing a lot of games. They're playing a lot of games with others. This might be relevant in a time when we feel less connected to our community than we did over previous decades. But there are also a couple of questions that arise out of what I've just presented, and you're probably thinking about them too, having worked in this space of technology-mediated interactions yourselves. Like, do games actually satisfy our need for social connection? Do digital games when they're played online, and how much? Is the efficacy of games compromised when we move them online and replace face-to-face conversation with just voice chat or text chat, or the game moves themselves? And these are the kind of questions that I've been asking, and part of what I've been working on with my students and colleagues over the last 15 to 25 years. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into it. And I feel free to stop me at any point in this if you have specific questions about what I'm talking about. Okay, so the first question is, how can we enact existing relationships through games? And I have a lot of work in this space, but I'm just going to show you two examples of recent work by a PhD student of mine, Raquel Robinson, who's now a professor at the University of Malmo. In this project, we looked at how synchronization over distance affects feelings of closeness and rapport. We know from literature in social psychology that mirroring, or doing the same movements as someone at the same time, is an intervention that's used to support the development of intimacy among dyads. In our case, we were looking at how mirroring or synchronization could be used as a game mechanic. So in this game, it's just an infinite runner game that people are playing. They had to synchronize both to stay in the middle lane and to duck under obstacles and avoid whirlpools. Instead of motion, though, in terms of mirroring, we used emotions as the input. So this was sensed through breathing in unison, maintaining the same heart rate. As you can see in this image, joint action and facial expressions, making a happy face or a look of disgust at the same time, would trigger movement in the game. And we had participants play this, we called it this embodied version of the game, where we used their physiological data as input to the game. And we also had them play a standard mouse and keyboard version of the game. And we showed that, playing the game did help all the players feel closer. But importantly, we took pictures of the players together before and after they played. So we had friends come into the lab, and then we took a picture of them. We sent them off to different rooms. They played games. We brought them back together to pay them and do the thing. And we took another picture of them. And what we did is we had totally different people rate those pictures online. So we used, I think, Amazon Mechanical Turk at the time, and we had them rate all the pictures in terms of how close and happy the pairs looked. And those who used the embodied game controls, those who were using the breathing and the physiology and all that kind of stuff, were rated as both happier and closer after playing than those who used the standard mouse and keyboard interface. This picture isn't participants. These are two of the authors. We didn't have ethical approval to use the actual participant pictures in a presentation. So two of the authors recreated in a dramatic recreation of what the pictures actually looked like. But it did show that the people who played this embodied version of the game were rated as happier and closer as a result of playing than those who played with the standard mouse and keyboard. We actually extended this idea into Twitch, which, if you don't know, is a streaming platform for computer games, among other things. We developed a survival shooter game that streamers would play on Twitch. So in Twitch, it's just like your typical live streaming context. A streamer will play a game, and then the spectators of that game can interface with the streamer through chat, basically through text chat. So what we did, though, is we had these online spectators who were in their homes, have their heart rate sensed through the webcam using a computer vision approach that senses blood flow changes in the forehead. And then these heart rates from all the online spectators were averaged and used to affect properties in the game. So in this case, we had it affect the difficulty of the game that they were playing. We had the heart rates affect the lighting and the environment, some of the sound as well. And we deployed this in the wild in a study with several very popular streamers with, audiences of several, like tens of thousands of people, to see if this kind of physiological input could help streamers and spectators feel closer or more connected, which our survey results showed that it actually did. Spectators used the chat to instruct each other on how to raise their heart rates and attempt to make the game more challenging for the streamer, leading to the streamer just begging them to calm down so that they could actually play the game and succeed at it. Of course, this is all entertainment value. So the fact that the spectators were banding together to try and make it really hard for the streamer was part of the enjoyment of the experience for everyone, obviously. Okay, so we can use games to help maintain existing relationships, but what about helping people use them to form new ones? And why would we even want to do that? So I'm going to show a series of examples in this area that were led by a former PhD student, Ansgar Depping, who went to work at Electronic Arts before he moved to Meta, and now he's at TikTok. Around the area, and as a UX researcher. But his work was around the area of developing trust. So why am I talking about trust all of a sudden when I've been talking about games? Well, it's relevant because we can always, all of us can kind of think back and remember working in a group and it was just great. Everyone's contributing, communication goes smoothly, things get accomplished, we feel great. And we've also, I'm sure, all experienced the opposite before. Situations in which team members are bickering, no one wants to take charge. The thanks at the end of emails start sounding a little bit passive aggressive. So where does good teamwork come from? Well, literature and organizational psychology suggests that it has a lot to do with trust. And trust is basically operationalized as the idea that we are vulnerable and that we rely on others. And well, you would know better than me, but I think that it's fairly common for companies to try and help their employees develop trust through different types of team building exercises. And for me, this whole, the company goes on a retreat and practices trust falls and does ropes courses thing seems like something from a movie, like that actually happened in Pitch Perfect 2 for any Pitch Perfect fans out there. But a while back, I was actually going to visit colleagues at Microsoft in Seattle. And while I was en route, my colleague texted me to ask if I brought exercise clothes, because one of the days they were doing a team building exercise and she was taking everyone to a ropes course. And that's one of the times where I understood that my life as a professor was very different than how things worked in the tech industry, because this is never something that I think would happen in my context. But the idea that people are, banding together and trying to develop trust in some way, whether it's, through a potluck or a team building exercise or some kind of icebreaker, is relatively common for companies with co-located employees. But distributed work environments of course became increasingly common over the last decade. fueled in part by, of course, stay-at-home orders due to COVID. In these last, in the pandemic years and since, it's been really tough to try and build trust in distributed teams. Because it's really tough to do a trust fall online, or do a ropes course in an online context. Or is it? And our research idea was that games have certain properties that make them a good candidate for helping distributed teams develop trust among each other. We felt like they had a lot in common with the kinds of things people are doing in team building exercises. So we set out to investigate whether we could use games as a way to help teams build trust. So what we did is we took an online cooperative interdependent game. This is a board game actually called Labyrinth. It's a German board game, and we implemented it in an online context. And we compared it to a social icebreaker task in terms of how well it helps two strangers develop trust online. So this game is cooperative and interdependent. So one player has to navigate the maze. You can sort of see them moving around to collect a gem. The other player has to push the tiles to create a path to take them there. It involves coordination and communication in order to succeed. The social icebreaker task that we used was a prompted series of questions about hobbies, pizza toppings, vacation preferences, other little bits of personal information. That's part of, personal information exchange and self-disclosure, which, according to social identity theory, should help people develop trust and between each other. So the takeaway of this study, The takeaway of the study is that the game worked much better than the social task at facilitating trust. Higher is better in this chart. This is how much trust they developed together. You could see that the game, which is the lighter line, is consistently high, whereas the social icebreaker task, which is the darker line, was a little bit lower, but also depended on some things. And so that was the interesting part of all of our findings from this study. The game was better than the social task. And the reason that it was because it was robust to all sorts of factors that undermine trust development. So individual factors, like in this graph, a person's propensity to trust, like that's how trusting somebody is as an individual. But we also looked at like someone's agreeableness according to the big five. We looked at experiential factors like how much they enjoyed the experience. And the social task and its success was dependent on all these things. But the game was resilient to the kind of things that undermine trust development among people. So it just worked better overall. In a follow-up study, we wanted to really unpack which of these game mechanics worked and why. So we created 4 versions of this game that varied in terms of the cooperation to competition, interdependence to independence. And we established some comparability between these 4 versions of the game. And then we looked at how it affected trust development. And we confirmed that both factors affected the relationship between players outside the game, affecting how much trust they were able to develop. These 2 strangers that played this game together online. We also extended this work by looking at how trust develops between dyads. In the context of these 2 strangers playing online again, we gathered features from their conversation, things like their facial expressions, their eye blink rate, their in-game performance, their conversational patterns, how many turns they took making the conversation, the tone of their voice, some other things like that. To see if we could determine how trust was forming and also to create AI models of developing interpersonal trust. And we showed that it worked for both classification and regression in both of these approaches, so that we could use these features to predict the amount of trust that developed between players. So these examples show how we can use games to form trust in new relationships developed online. And as an aside, there's a lot of other good things we can learn from online social gameplay, like how to survive a moose attack. I don't know how many of you would know this story, but in 2007, a 12-year-old Norwegian boy was attacked by a moose. In the article, he describes how he first yelled at the moose, distracting it so that his sister got away. This is called taunting, a move that one uses in World of Warcraft to get monsters off the less well-armored team members. And then when he got attacked and the animal stood over him, he pretended to be dead. And he said in an interview, just like you learn at level 30 in World of Warcraft. So he learned these 2 moves by playing World of Warcraft and then applied it in the context in which he and his sister were being attacked by a moose. So I don't think anyone should ever tell you that playing World of Warcraft is a waste of time, because it could save your life one day if you are attacked by a moose in Norway or in Canada. Okay. So we can use games to help maintain relationships that are existing. And we can use games to help build new relationships. But how does this work when people have different interests or abilities? How can we design multiplayer games effectively under these circumstances when maybe two people don't have the same abilities or even interests or skills or capacities? So what we know about this is we know that multiplayer games are fun, but they're not always enjoyable when the skill levels of players are vastly different. It isn't fun for anyone if one player is destroying everyone else. The losing players become frustrated and discouraged because the game is too difficult, and the better players will become disengaged because the game's too easy. There's no suspense when the outcome is certain, which is really not fun for anyone. And we see this all the time in sports. It's embarrassing. This is shown in a headline from last year where the the Canucks, which is of course my team being on the West Coast, beat the Oilers 8-1. For those of you that are hockey fans, this is a pretty drastic score differential in the game of hockey. But just so I don't get high on my horse as a Canucks fan, I have to point out this game in the 80s, in which the same matchup went very heavily in the other direction, and the Oilers beat the Canucks 13-0. But what we do know is that it's hard to balance a game when the challenge is determined by the skill of another player. The difficulty of the game comes from your opponent, not from the game system itself. And the opponent's skills and behaviors can't be controlled by the game system. And so we conducted multiple lines of research over the years to address this imbalance and look at how to create good play experiences when players have differing abilities. We did a bunch of studies involving a duck hunt clone using Wiimotes, and then we looked at using simulated drivers in a racing game that we custom developed in Microsoft's XNA. This was the last year that it was supported, that particular technology. And although I have done a lot of experiments with the NHL game in my research, today I'm just going to walk through a series of studies that we did using a custom first-person shooter that we built in Unreal Engine. So we built the shooter where it had like a walkthrough level like this. And then we also, at the end of the walkthrough level, we had a shooting gallery that you'll see here, where you can kind of actually really control what people are doing. And for those of you that maybe, took HCI back in the 90s, like I did, you would recognize it as basically a fits task, but, it's like a fancier fits task with, headshots instead of just clicking on targets. So our first paper investigated, I'll just show that again. Our first paper investigated whether or not aiming assistance could improve performance in a first-person shooter in the context of a single-player game. So with aiming assistance, what we did is we used things like bullet magnetism. We increased the size of the target, that like the hitbox of the target, these kind of approaches. And we showed that it worked. And our next paper took these aiming assistance techniques and applied them in a multiplayer scenario where we had people competing against an opponent. And it worked really well. Aim assistance minimized the score differential. So the score between the players, the difference of scores between the players was a lot closer. And it even worked for pairings with really large skill differences. So when we paired like a novice with an expert player, it still worked really well. Assistance basically improved the perception of fairness and competence for the weaker player without detracting from the perceived fairness and competence of the stronger player. And although assistance affected only the weaker player's performance and how competent they felt, the enjoyment actually increased for both players when matches were balanced. So aiming assistance works, and it works by helping that weaker player kind of achieve a better performance without detracting from that stronger player's performance. And then when things are equal, everyone's kind of happier. So yeah, it benefited those novices, and it didn't detract from the experience of the experts. And despite the large degree of assistance that we sometimes provided to players, they didn't even notice it. Perceptibility of the assistance when we asked about it was very low. Most people did not know that somebody was being assisted, which led us to ask the question, well, what if they did notice? What happens when you tell people that you're helping them? When people know, do they feel like they're cheating or being cheated if they're the stronger player? Because there's reasons to believe that they may. Cheating in sports and games has a long history that we've also been investigating, actually. But to illustrate, this is a photo of Femke van de Driesche. A few years ago, she was disqualified from the World Cyclocross Championship for having a motor hidden in her bike that assisted her in the race. She was banned from the sport for 6 years, and she announced her retirement from cycling at the age of 19. Most of us probably hear this and think, well, that's fair. She deserves this because she cheated. She had a motor hidden in her bike, and that's against the rules. She cheated. She deserves the punishment. But a family bike tour, on the other hand, is a different matter. If a grandfather wants to use a motor in his bike to keep up with his grandson, he probably isn't going to be banned from family activities for the next 6 years. So a bike race can be held in two different settings. It can be competitive, but it could also be a social experience. And the setting determines whether or not we accept that kind of assistance for the weaker players. So while a friendly bike race between a grandson and a grandfather is mostly a social activity, it can still be competitive in nature. But what we learned from our previous work and what we know about competition in general is that it is most engaging when it is balanced. So back to our first-person shooter game. We recruited expert and novice pairs and had them compete against each other. And in half the pairs, we told them that we were assisting the weaker player. We disclosed that there was aiming assistance happening, and we asked whether disclosure was harmful to the experience. But what we found was it wasn't. So assistance increased enjoyment and suspense for both players. Again, the weaker players felt more competent and less tense. There were no negative effects of disclosure at all. And so we were kind of wondering, well, why? Why was disclosure not harmful? Why did people not feel that this was problematic in some way? And we discussed in the paper how engagement in a balanced game is more powerful than disclosure of the assistance, and that the game setting really does change expectations. So when you're playing to have fun, and you're playing to be social, it is better to have a quality experience and not worry so much about the competition. In a tournament, of course, like in an esports tournament with $34 million at stake, you might feel very differently. But in the context that most people are playing games, they're playing to have a good time and to spend time with others. And that changed the expectations of the players. There's also this thing called self-serving attribution bias, which you might know about, in which people tend to attribute success to themselves and failure to external influences. So, if you've submitted a CHI paper, for example, and your CHI reviews are really great, then it's because you're a great writer and you've done a great job expressing your ideas. And if they're bad, well, it's because reviewer 2 doesn't understand anything and they don't understand qualitative methods at all. So we tend to attribute success to ourselves and blame to others. But what we found is that assistance still works, basically, even when you tell players that you're assisting them. Okay, so some of you maybe still be skeptical on the value of assistance because you might be thinking that assisting people will impede their skill development over time, that if you keep helping people, they won't get better at the activity, because there's reasons to believe that as well, something called the guidance hypothesis. But we did test that too. In a complex multi-day study involving shooting galleries and many game walkthroughs, we looked at, we had people do a shooting gallery exercise, and then over a number of days, we had them do a bunch of walkthroughs that were assisted. And then we took assistance away at the end and tested how much learning gain they had over that time. And the takeaway is that assisting players did not at all impede their skill development. It helped them when they were being assisted, but it didn't affect their learning gains when we took it away. We also replicated this result with a navigation assistance in 3D environments in 2 different studies using Quake Live. So for both shooting and navigation, assisting people helped the experience, didn't detract from their learning at all. And finally, we even did this. This even works when it balances for extreme differences in skill or ability. This is a project from a long time ago that combined my work on extra gaming with this work on balancing, looking at how to effectively balance games between people, extra games, when people have vastly different physical abilities. So this was actually on a Microsoft Kinect device, which some of you remember. That's maybe like it's a camera. And we created a toolkit that people could use their wheelchair as input to the game. So if they turned to the side, it was kind of like a side step. And if they pushed forward, it was like a forward step. But of course, turning your wheelchair to the side takes a lot more effort than just stepping to the side. So we created a bunch of different algorithms that we use to balance the difficulty in this game between these 2 interfaces. And we found that people enjoy the game. They didn't notice the balancing when we did it in certain ways. And they really enjoyed the experience. And for the people in the wheelchairs, they really enjoyed that the technology empowered them to use their wheelchair as an input into a game system in the same way that the able-bodied players were just able to use the dance mat. Okay. So we know that games do work to help maintain and build social connections, even when people have vastly different abilities and skills. So we started looking at maybe a little bit more on how they satisfy us and why. I'm just checking the time. This started. Yeah, okay. And so we ran a series of studies. We've had many studies that I'm not going to go into detail on because we've been exploring how how this happens, and to explore how this happens, to try and develop the theory of how this is happening. We've been using structural equation modeling and random intercept control lag panel models and other statistical modeling techniques, which some of you may be into, some of you maybe aren't into. Maybe some of you are into it, but not on a Monday evening. So I'm just happy to give more details here if you would like. But what I will just do is talk at the high level of the kind of work that we've been doing, mostly through self-report. And we've been looking at how passion for gaming builds social capital and how social capital is useful for combating loneliness and satisfying our need for relatedness to others, which ultimately leads to well-being. We've confirmed these relationships both before and during the pandemic and within multiple game genres. We've looked at this within MOBAs, like role-playing games, first-person shooters, and most recently, we gathered a year-long study with 4,000 adolescents or young gamers in Australia to look at how these relationships change over time. I won't get into too many of the details of the models, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards, but the idea is that passion is dualistic. It can be harmonious, which means it's in balance with the rest of your life, or it can be obsessive, which means that it's kind of like a controlled experience. And what we've shown in a number of studies now is, harmonious passion for gaming, even if it's really high, even if you're a super passionate gamer, if it's in balance with the rest of your life, it actually can lead to benefits. It leads to social capital, both bridging and bonding for those of you who are familiar with this construct, which in turn combats loneliness and leads to well-being. And what I love about this whole line of work is that we show that the relationships that were built inside of a game have real out-of-game benefits to the people who play them. So play, which is not intended as necessarily serious, has these very serious out-of-game benefits to the players themselves. And we've extended this beyond what you might consider as typical games in our investigation into how playing pinball actually supported men's mental being in work that was funded by the Movember Foundation. This study, I think, was really interesting because we learned a lot about how playing together, shoulder to shoulder in a pinball arcade, helped the men in our study feel really connected to others. And they were able to disclose personal information for garnering social support in ways that weren't accessible to them otherwise. So by playing together regularly in these pinball arcades, they would talk about pinball. But then over time, they would develop relationships with the people they were playing with, and then they would start to talk about other things. And they mentioned in our study, they were talking about things like, these guys really helped them kind of work through when they were going through a divorce, or one man who lost his job. And they really attributed a lot of the social support to this pinball context in which they were able just to talk to other people, maybe when they didn't feel like that was something they were necessarily able to do if they were sitting face to face, over a coffee. A very different way of communicating that was very supportive to them. So I want to end, well, I'm not going to end, but I wanted to kind of end the talk on what I've presented so far has been a really rosy picture. Games are helping people connect to each other. They're combating loneliness. They're building friendships. They're supporting the development of trust. But I know that you guys have been on the internet, so I know that it's not always the nicest of places. There are sometimes people on the internet who aren't nice, and they don't just hang out on Reddit or 8chan or 4chan or whatever. They also play games. So a lot of our work more recently has been looking at, can the benefits of social play that I've been talking about be undermined? Can they be undermined by things like toxicity? So toxic behaviors, hate and harassment are a reality of many online multiplayer games. In recent surveys, more than 80% of adult gamers reported that they've experienced harassment in a multiplayer game. And this is, of course, problematic for a lot of reasons. It ruins the player experience. It causes psychological distress to players. It results in social withdrawal of players. And that also leads to players leaving a game, which can affect the revenues of the gaming companies. And we recently actually demonstrated that a toxic game community prevents the building of social capital in play, which can in turn decrease how much relatedness satisfaction we gain through play and experience and increase our experience of loneliness. So in this paper here, we show that toxicity is a thing that actually increases loneliness in a gaming community, which ultimately harms well-being. So toxicity is bad. Everyone knows it's bad, and yet it persists. Why? So we've been doing a number of studies looking at toxicity, why it persists, what people like, how it develops, for whom toxic behaviors are exhibited. We asked, this is a very difficult thing to study scientifically. Ethically, you can't just expose people to toxic content that's like personalized for them. You can't bring someone into a lab and then be really toxic to them. It's not ethically okay. And also they probably wouldn't even feel it in the same way that they would feel it if, you know, a friend that they were playing with is toxic to them. So we've been looking at new ways to kind of understand and unpack toxicity scientifically. So we've been using clips of games from Twitch of players being toxic and asking people um, kind of to rate them and then to talk about whether or not they would report that clip and why or why not they would report it. And through this, we surfaced a cycle of normalization of toxicity in multiplayer gaming, in which gamers said it was just banter. It was typical of games, was acceptable within a gaming context. And they also noted it wasn't their problem to solve. It's like, not my monkeys, not my zoo. And we've also been looking at reasons why toxicity develops. In addition to like online disinhibition, which you might know from the social media context, we also identified 4 different traits from sports psychology that predict a person's greater likelihood to minimize the harm that toxicity produces. These are things like dehumanizing people, stripping them of their human qualities, you know, placing blame on others to avoid personal responsibility. Conduct reconstrual means that you're like reframing toxic behaviors as less harmful. You're kind of deliberately justifying why it's not bad. And distortion of consequences is like minimizing the harm that's caused to others. So these kinds of characteristics were, you know, how toxicity is allowed to percolate. Using these same data, we were building machine learning models that predicted the toxicity labels of a clip up to 84% accuracy. So we were looking at whether or not we could predict toxicity, but the problem with focusing on the detection of toxicity is that, you know, what happens when you find it? The harm has already happened. If you're focusing on detection, which a lot of the game companies are doing, the harm has already been done. If you can detect it, the player has already experienced it. And what do you do when you find people being toxic? You can't just ban everyone who's toxic. Recent work shows that it's actually not just a few bad actors that are toxic, but a large proportion of the people are toxic some of the time. Because sometimes it's about who they are as a person, but sometimes it's just about what they're going through that day. You know, if they're having a bad day and they're frustrated, they may act toxically, which is out of character for them. So you can't just ban everyone who's toxic. So we need to focus on predicting it before it happens and preventing it from developing, which is the focus of some of our work. And we also need to help support people when it's actually happened to them. And so this is a very traditional HCI study that we did. So I kind of like it because it's in the context of toxicity, but it's very kind of HCI-ish, where we created storyboards of different coping tools. And then we had participants rate them. And in a second study, we implemented these medium fidelity prototypes of in JavaScript so they could pretend like they were happening in a game context, but pop them up in a transparent window on top of the game. Then we looked at how these different coping tools helped support people after they had been exposed to toxicity. So we looked at tools that were really internally focused, ones that were more focused on the perpetrator, and ones that were more focused on like dealing with their emotions or providing them a sense of control in the environment. And we measured how much each tool helped to reduce the stress and improve the mood using a pre and post experiment design. The takeaway from this study was that all the tools were able to help increase the feelings of control for the participants and improve their mood. So all the ones that we developed were better than doing nothing at all. But their success varied depending on the individual themselves and what type of coping strategies they like to use. Finally, in another study, we showed that players use a variety of coping strategies and that their preferred in-game coping strategies relate to their general style of coping. Like, are they more emotion-focused? Are they more problem-focused coper? Are they more avoidant? And the effectiveness of these coping approaches that we uncovered in the games depended on the availability of in-game tool support for that coping strategy. So if people felt like they were able to block the source of the toxicity, or whether they were more likely just to accept the problem, confront the perpetrator, switch contexts, so move to a different game environment, or seek support, which is like trying to get support from their friends or teammates being like, that guy was being rude, right? That wasn't just me. Like, that guy was being rude, right? And so we've been looking at these different types of coping strategies. And all of this work has led myself and my collaborators to work on this big theoretical model of toxicity in games. I don't need to walk, through all this, and this is the first time that I've actually shown this slide publicly, but it's something that we're really working on, looking at, who you are and what you're going through, so that disposition and your situation can lead to very different toxic behaviors that may be intentional, but they may also be more due to a lack of regulation. And these behaviors can be actions or communications, which vary in their severity and affect players, publishers, and communities. The interventions that the industry is looking at right now are primarily reactive, which is the red on the bottom. So they aim to reduce the likelihood of recurrence. But what we need to be doing is looking at more proactive measures that will aim to prevent the behavior before it even happens. So anyways, this is the work in progress, but contributing to theory is something that I'm quite excited by, and it's something that I've been working a lot with my collaborators and students. Okay, so to go back to the beginning a bit, our work has shown that games can help us maintain existing relationships and help us build new ones. Games can be used in this way even when our interests or abilities are vastly different from each other. And our work also investigates how games satisfy our need for social connection. There is a generation of golf or bowling buddies who play together. We're now part of a new generation of clan members, guilds, raiding parties. People play chess in the park. Now they play Destiny in a mythic science fiction world. They play League in Runeterra. They play together in the world of Warcraft. So can we harness the motivational pull of games to benefit people? Our research suggests yes, and not just by creating games for serious purposes, but by designing for human connection. Games aren't the socially isolating experiences that some people claim them to be. They can be used to build new relationships, maintain existing ones, and offer new opportunities for helping people satisfy their need for social interaction and feel connected to others, which makes me feel a little bit better about this situation that I mentioned earlier in the talk. And as a side note, during the pandemic, these kids were playing online together most days and every weekend. Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite, they played D&D. They were closer to each other than they ever had been, even though we hadn't seen each other in person in literal years. And when we moved out west in 2022, they started playing together in person, like the best of friends who knew each other for ages, even though their relationship had been entirely built playing together online. They continue to play online now, Roblox, Minecraft, and they're also part of like a weekly D&D campaign over Zoom with the other cousins as well. Is this the whole story of my research agenda? Absolutely not. There's lots of interesting stuff that my trainees and I have done together that I'm not going to get into today, but I'll just let you know in case it's something that you want to follow up on later. We've also looked at the cognitive and emotional benefits of gaming, not just the social benefits of gaming. So I talked a lot about social today, but we do also work on recovery from stress, benefits to emotional regulation, and the cognitive benefits of games using a bunch of different methods. A second area of research is that we do use machine learning approaches to look at how in-game behaviors can be used as digital biomarkers of mental health concerns, focusing mostly on the assessment of depression, psychosis, social anxiety, and stress. We have demonstrated that we can use these game-based biomarkers, but it does open the door. It opens the door to remote assessment for millions of people that would provide mental health benefits, but it also has the potential to result in stealthy and unethical monitoring from game companies that could cause harm. So I'm a little bit hesitant with this work to move forward just because it can provide so much benefit, but this kind of surveillance economy can also cause a lot of harm. And related to assessment, we also look at how we combat attrition in different interventions using games. So keeping people more engaged in what they're doing through game-based interventions, which you might know more called normally gamification or serious game design. We apply all this in the context of recreational gaming, but also in competitive play or esports, looking at performance under pressure, which is known as clutching or choking, looking at whether we can improve performance in a game using things like electrical brain stimulation, like we put electrodes on the head and put currents through your brain, and we actually show that you can improve performance on a game. And along these lines, we've also been examining things like problematic play, obsessive passion, this kind of stuff using machine learning on large data sets that are open source, but are also provided to us from game companies and esports platforms. And to do all this, we also conduct work on standard games user research, which is like UX, but in the context of games. So how do we model players and understand their experiences? Working both with game companies, indie studios, AAA studios, we have invented new and improved ways of assessing whether a game under development is fun. And to do all this work, it's not me that's doing it, it's my students. And my colleagues so I'd like to thank them all for what they've contributed. This is a picture taken in Saskatoon a number of years ago, but there are a lot of the people that I talked about today did the work while I was there. And this is my new lab in Victoria. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.